Joining us from Montreal is Gil Troy. He's a professor of American history at McGill University and author of Why I Am a Zionist: Israel, Jewish Identity, and the Challenges of Today. Norman Finkelstein is here with me in our Firehouse studio. He's professor of political science at DePaul University. His latest book is called Beyond Chutzpah, on the misuse of anti-Semitism and the abuse of history. Welcome you both to Democracy Now! Let's begin with Professor Troy. Your response to President Carter's book.
He calls this title provocative. I call it offensive. It's offensive to South Africans because to use the term apartheid, which is about white supremacy and a systematic approach of discrimination and racism, demeans the very difficult struggle and the odious examples of South African oppression. It's also offensive to Zionists and to Jews and to anyone who supports the state of Israel, because while in his remarks that we heard, Jimmy Carter makes a distinction between what goes on inside Israel and in the territories, he did not do that in his book, which is actually quite shoddy and quite erratic. And I think, it's also a disservice to the people of the world and good people who want peace, because if you want to truly be a mediator, try to find the complexity, try to show the complexity on both sides, the failures of both sides, rather than having this one-sided approach which basically throws water on any hopes for peace and actually throws gasoline on the fires of the Middle East.
Professor Finkelstein.
Well, the question, it seems to me, is whether or not the term apartheid is appropriate in this context. I'm not going to, for the moment, I'm not going to make an argument either way. The question I would raise is, if the term is, as it's often been said recently, if the term is anti-Semitic or contrary to the interests of Jews, however you want to put it, how do you account for the fact that so many mainstream figures and organizations in Israeli life themselves use the term apartheid to characterize the Israeli occupation, the West Bank and Gaza? You take the case of B'Tselem, the Israeli Information Center for Human Rights in the occupied territories. In May 2002, they put out a report entitled Land Grab. It's a substantial report. It's not throwing around slogans and terms. The report's about 150 pages based on quite in-depth research. They conclude in their report that Israel has established a regime in the occupied territories, which is, as they put it, reminiscent of the South African apartheid regime. This past year, B'Tselem put out another report entitled Forbidden Roads on what they call the road regime in the occupied territories. Again, they concluded that this is reminiscent of the apartheid regime in South Africa. You take the case of Haaretz, Israel's leading newspaper, or most influential newspaper. And in their editorials, they routinely refer to the apartheid-like regime in the occupied territories. So for the moment, I would like to focus on the question, why is it illegitimate to use the term? Why is it anti-Semitic to use the term here, whereas in Israel, just yesterday, Shulamith Aloni, the former cabinet minister for education under Rabin, she says everybody here knows it's apartheid. So why is it illegitimate for a former American president to use a term which is a commonplace? I'm not saying everyone agrees it's apartheid in Israel, but it's certainly part of the mainstream discourse. Why are you in the United States disqualified from participating in what in Israel is part of the mainstream discourse?
Professor Troy.
First of all, I didn't accuse the former president of anti-Semitism. I didn't accuse him of not having the qualifications to jump into debate. I think the term is historically offensive and inaccurate. I said it's offensive to South Africans. I said it's offensive to people who want peace in the Middle East. Just because there are many Israeli leftists and many Israeli critics of Israeli policy who use the term doesn't mean that it's a legitimate term. As a historian, I can say it's a false historical analogy. What I learned from that is that in the United States and in Israel, unlike the country that Jimmy Carter pretends to live in, there is a vigorous debate on the Israeli side. There is a vigorous debate on the American side. There isn't a vigorous debate on the Palestinian side, which doesn't have the same kind of political culture. It actually has a toxic political culture where right now we've seen over 500 Palestinians killing each other in an internecine civil war. So I'd like to focus on the question that has been sidestepped of, is it an accurate and is it a helpful term? And I say it's not, because let's look at what apartheid was. Apartheid was a regime started in the South Africans in the 1940s as an attempt, and it started actually with a kind of sexual revulsion on the part of whites against blacks, to truly degrade blacks. And the community of nations, it took them decades, but the community of nations justifiably said, this is so odious that we want to kind of vomit out, and I use the term advisedly, vomit out South Africa from the community of nations because they're so despicable. When Israelis use the term, they're being provocative and they're being incendiary, they're being inaccurate. When the former president of the United States, a Nobel Peace Prize winner, uses the term, it's even more destructive, because what he's doing is he's giving it a kind of legitimacy to a Zionist movement which has already been libeled as being racist. And it feeds, and I see it on campus where there's quite a vigorous criticism of Israel every day. They use the term Israel apartheid, and they don't distinguish between the territories and Israel. They look at it as an illegitimate country, and Jimmy Carter, who's shown a capacity for friendship of all kinds of dictators from North Korea to China to Cuba, all of a sudden seems to have quite a harsh perspective when it comes to Israel, and I wonder why.
Norman Finkelstein.
I agree that we shouldn't fixate on terms. We should look beneath the terms and see whether they accurately represent the reality. And that's what I think those who have used that term have tried to do. So you take the case of B'Tselem. It publishes a report, and it says Israel has constructed in the occupied territories what it calls a roads regime, with roads for Jews only. They go on to say that Israel is...
Explain that. What do you mean?
Well,
exactly?
there are roads which connect the settlements in the occupied territories with Israel. And those roads, there's various kinds of laws and various degrees. It's a complex system. But those laws effectively mean that Jews are the only ones who are allowed to use these roads connecting the occupied territories to Israel. And Palestinians have to take these circuitous routes in order to get from one part of the occupied territories to another. In 2002, the B'Tselem report points to the fact that the kinds of settlements and the kinds of laws in the occupied territories resemble the apartheid system, in that there's a different system of laws for Palestinians and there's a different system of laws for Israelis. So it's not so important, in my opinion, to fixate on the term. I agree. It can become sloganeering, but we should look at the policies. We should look at what's going on. Jimmy Carter has, in my opinion, a compelling section of the book. It's chapter 16, which I would encourage your listeners to look at, where it's entitled "The Wall as a Prison." And in chapter 16, he goes through the wall that Israel is building in the occupied territories. Now, I want to emphasize, because there's so much misinformation on this topic in the United States, I suspect that Professor Troy is going to immediately jump in and say it's not a wall, just as Ethan Bronner, the deputy foreign editor of the New York Times, notes parenthetically that the edifice that Israel is building is only 4% a wall. Well, these issues have been resolved legally. The International Court of Justice in July 2004, when it adjudicated the question of the wall that Israel is building in the occupied territories, at the very beginning it says there has been some dispute about the language used. Should we call it a fence? Should we call it a barrier? Should we call it a wall? And the International Court of Justice, going through all the possibilities, exploring the linguistic resonances of all the terms, it concludes we should call it a wall. When Jimmy Carter uses that term, he is using the term which has been agreed to by consensus in the International Court of Justice. And I should add that Human Rights Watch, a mainstream human rights organization, in its publications and in accordance with international law and the International Court of Justice, uses the term wall. And Jimmy Carter says what's happening in the occupied territories is Israel's confiscating about 10% of Palestinian land inside the wall. And he says, I thought it was a compelling point, he says Israel will not only control all the Palestinians within the wall, but Israel has de facto also annexed the Jordan Valley, which means all the Palestinians between the Jordan Valley and the wall will also be controlled by Israel. they are creating, and Jimmy Carter, I think, with a certain amount of candor, he said, I don't think it should be called a separation fence. I think it should be called an imprisonment.